Now, this is a new series called Economics Gone Stupid. And to start it off, I got to do Richard Wolff. He's a professor and author of many books on economics, and the basics is he's a Marxist economics, which right there just tells you what you're in store for is just mental gymnastics on a stage you just have not seen. And he's always great for a chuckle. So here we go.
Well, one of the biggest items in the news this last week was an announcement of yet another merger of mega corporations. AT&T, the phone company, is going to merge with Time Warner, the entertainment company, for lack of a better term.
Okay, so there's a giant merger between AT&T and Time Warner. All right, now explain to me how this is a monopoly.
These are two mega corporations among the biggest already in their industries, and so this will make a mega corporation where there used to be just two megas.
Again, also remember these are two companies that are big in their respective industries, but two different industries. So how does this lead to monopoly? Because there are still larger companies in both respective fields. So I'm waiting to see how this gets to a monopoly.
What does this do? What is this about? Well, this is called the problem of monopoly. It is as old as capitalism because it turns out that the capitalist system has built into it mechanisms which we call competition. We like to talk about competition, but we are hesitant most of the time to ask and pursue the question, where does competition lead?
Okay, again, how is this a monopoly? I'm sure you're getting there somehow.
And it turns out that competition leads to its own extinction. Competition wipes itself out and becomes instead monopoly.
Okay, competition leads to monopoly. Now, I have to think that he's going to have a number of examples.
In other words, if two or more companies compete, one of them makes a better product, or one of them lowers the price, or if they're really good, they can make a better product at a lower price, and that destroys the business of who their competitors were. Where there were many companies, those who do the best job at lowering the price and or improving the quality of the work, they win. And typically the winner in competition eats the loser. That is, the loser goes out of business. The people who worked for the losing company now look for jobs in the company that won. The people who supplied the losing company look for customers in the companies that won. And so the many become few. We're familiar with that, all of us who pay attention.
Oh, God, man, he did it right off the bat. Okay, let's start with the stupid design that he had here. He leaves out the fact that companies can still continuously be born to go into competition with current companies. He makes it act like there's a set value that you start off with, and then it just gobbles up down to one. Then look at the chart he shows. You think he'd give a concrete example of where he had a monopoly due to capitalism. What does he show us? The car industry. Now, there are about 15 bars on that graph. For one, how is that a monopoly? How are 15 different companies a monopoly? Not only that, the last bar is other, so there could be dozens of other car companies. Tesla isn't even listed, and they're a new car company. He basically shows a graph which destroys his own argument. The only way this would support him is that at some point we were going to have one car company. But you think he'd use an example of where he got down to one or two. This guy's hilarious. How? That would not be accepted in my grade school.
We know that there are very few car companies in the world, and very few cigarette companies, and very few fill-in-the-blank companies.
Okay, let's see here. There are very few car companies. Well, your graph seems to indicate there are a bunch of car companies, but how many do you want? Thousands? It's not like anyone can just walk outside and start a car company. You need tons of machineries and startup money in order to build a factory to be cost competitive. So I would say that if you have dozens of car companies, that's pretty good. And let's use the other example. There are only so many cigarette companies. Who gets into cigarettes? Cigarettes, if you start a cigarette company, you're likely to get sued the moment you sell your first cigarette. The government has a war on cigarettes, so why in the world would anyone start a cigarette company? Why didn't he use a different example? Is it perhaps he doesn't have one? I would have loved to have heard another example, one that actually made sense. One that doesn't have a whole lot of government regulation and people suing them all the time, like cigarettes, and a car company, which you got disproved by your own graph.
Capitalism leads to monopoly.
You haven't proven your point. You didn't even come close.
Why? Well, by the way, monopoly is not the only thing capitalism leads to in this way. It will often lead to a situation where there isn't one company left standing, but maybe a handful, a small number. The kind of small number where they can get together legally or illegally, publicly or privately, and work things out amongst them. Something much harder to do if there are hundreds, let alone thousands of companies. When you have just a few and they can control the situation, we call that an oligopoly.
Okay, here's him moving the goalpost. Probably because he knows he has no point about monopoly, so he goes to oligarchy. Now, I've tried to look this up. There is no legal way they're allowed to conclude together. Please tell me how Ford is with Chrysler and GM and Mercedes-Benz and all conspiring against us.
Rather than a monopoly when there's literally only one left. So, what's the point? The reason companies merge is it's profitable. It's a way to be able to charge higher prices because having merged with the company that might have competed with you...
Now, it's worth stopping here to go back to his original example. And it disproves his original example. Time Warner and AT&T are not merging in order to get rid of competition. He just meanders all over. It's great.
They not compete with you anymore because you've literally absorbed them. You're now the decision maker. They're not. And that's what I want to focus on. When AT&T and Time Warner merge, if they pull it off, if the government permits it, and that means ultimately if you and I permit it, then where we once had two boards of directors, two groups of 20 people, and the big shareholders that stood behind them, we will now only have one. Oligopoly mergers like this reduce the number of people from the already small minority that control our economy to an even smaller one.
And for the love of God, he goes back to the example, which doesn't even have anything to do with the point he's making. How did this guy become a professor? And here his example doesn't even make sense. Now you have two boards merging. That's in theory. But the two boards can't merge because they're two different industries, and you're going to need a board to manage each board. You're going to need more people. You're going to need a board above the board to manage the boards because they're two different industries. If they were the same industry, then you could make this argument.
Concentrated. It's a little bit like my having to report to you that the inequality of the United States was actually becoming worse, that the people at the top were using their wealth to become even wealthier, to widen the gap between rich and poor. And here we see the same thing going on in this capitalist system that pushes in that direction. Is it happening across the board?
Now, this point makes absolutely no sense. First off, it has nothing to do with his original point. What does wealth inequality have to do with capitalism leading to a monopoly? And let's also talk about it as an example. The wealthy are using their wealth to get wealthier. No shit! Shouldn't the poor be using whatever they can to get wealthier? Isn't everyone trying to get wealthier?
Yes, it is. Let me just read off to you a list of some of the mega giants planning to merge or already underway. Walgreens and Rite Aid, Alaska Air and Virgin America, Dow Chemical and DuPont. Well, all of this brought to my attention a recent paper.
Now, all those companies are planning to try to merge. Who knows how many of them will actually succeed or how many will actually be allowed. But what he doesn't say is how much of a market share are those companies going to get. And I can bring up other companies that dominated the market. Remember Kodak? How about Xerox? Both those companies were dominant in their field and now are quite a bit smaller than they were in their heyday. Just because two companies are merging doesn't mean things are going to get better for them. But he seems to insinuate this.
And make more money off of us. So these scholars looked into that. Basically, their findings are the following. Having looked at many mergers, using careful techniques of analysis over a long period of time, bottom line, it didn't do much for efficiency, but it did do a lot for market power. In plain English, mergers are not about becoming more efficient, Mergers are to make one company more powerful than the two were separately before, so they can jack up the prices and make more profits off of us, which is why we have opposed them throughout our history, although the companies have figured out how to get around those regulations as well.
So actually, let's bring this back to his original thesis: capitalism leads to monopoly. Now, if this merger between two mega corporations leads to less efficiency and more pricing power, then wouldn't it stand to say that a competitor could come in and beat their efficiency and have a pricing power and be able to compete against the big boys? Doesn't bring up that point. But before I end this, let me just think of a few examples of other industries which must be monopolies in our capitalist system. Let's talk about, let's go with the beer industry. The beer industry has been around since the founding of the country. There have been beer taverns, people, all that, and there have been plenty of companies. Now, the biggest, obviously, we know as Anheuser-Busch, but they're not the only biggest. And let's look, even though we do have some giant corporations in the beer industry, there are thousands of microbrews, thousands of other breweries operating as well at different sizes. Sierra Nevada, Boston Beer Company. There seems to be more diversity in this industry than there was when it started. So how does your premise work here? It does not. And you look through it all. Hey, the soda industry. How about the phone industry? There are a lot of different phone manufacturers. There are a few big ones, but there are also a whole lot of smaller ones. Again, his arguments don't hold up to the facts if you look into them. And this is why this guy's so great. His arguments are complete stupidity. Now, allow me to tell you what he was really railing about. He's not talking about capitalism. He's railing against big businesses or big corporations in order to get people to hate capitalism. A lot of people don't like big corporations because everybody has a bad experience with one. But nowhere did he actually prove his point where capitalism went to monopolies. There are just so many problems with this argument. It's just him spouting an ideology and not giving any proof. And this is why this guy's hilarious. Someday I need to do it how he kind of selectively picks at history to try and prove his points. And this is an economist gone stupid.